Welcome into the FORE Golfers Network podcast. I'm Bill Hobson, and today we're answering a very important question. What do we do with Tiger Woods now? And here to help answer that question from Golf Digest is Joel Beall. Straight ahead. Probably the most asked question these days among golf fans is what's next for Tiger Woods, and really what should we be wishing for? What do we do with Tiger Woods? And it was just a few days ago that I read a really good story from Joel Beall of Golf Digest about that very subject. Part of it was, I think, inspired by I have to label them as sad scenes that we all took in at Augusta when the limp it was hard to watch. And certainly at that moment, we thought, well, this is it. This is it forever. And then another surgery has followed and all those things. So, Joel, first of all, thank you for coming on the program and talking about all this. And if I had to just launch our conversation with one question, and that question is, what do we do with Tiger Woods? Where would you like to start?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. But you're right. It's a very open-ended question, and it's a question that's been asked for seemingly the past decade. For the first time, though, it feels like there's a little finality behind that question and a little bit of a clear idea of where he could be going. You mentioned the scenes at Augusta. Yeah, it was certainly punctuated by that final scene on Saturday, limping back to the bag and a downpour. But what was really the genesis for this idea was earlier in the week during a practice round he had with Tom Kim, Fred Couples, and Rory McIlroy. It's kind of a recurring joke of when Tiger has a practice round, he has a bunch of people follow, and you hear, man, he looks great, or the swing looks good. And it's a joke because it's really hard to ascertain much from a practice round. Everybody looks good during a practice round. And yet on that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, Tiger really looked like he was struggling to walk at Augusta National. And obviously that's one of the harder walks in professional golf, but the fact that he was just struggling to get it around 9 holes really kind of set the stage of, man, are we sure he's got much left in the tank? And really what a credit to him that he was able to make the cut despite the state he's in right now. But I think what we saw at Augusta just underlined that I know we've counted Tiger Woods out many a time, and he's made a lot of people look foolish for that, but it really seems like the end is near.
I've got a few more years on this planet than you do, so I can remember when Tiger was a whole lot younger, but you've probably covered the majority of his career. And when you realize where he was versus where he is, for me, it's as hard to watch as when I remember Muhammad Ali going back into the ring like 3 times too many. In his case, because a crooked promoter by the name of Don King had robbed him blind, and I think he went back in mostly for the money. That's not the case with Tiger. He's doing fairly well. I don't think there are any bake sales in his future. So is it just pride? Why keep putting yourself through this agony?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see it not just with Tiger, but with golfers or athletes, I should say, across the sports spectrum. It's for most of these athletes, this is all they've done their entire lives. They don't know what to do with themselves outside of their game. And more importantly, it's anyone who's played any type of sports, no matter what level of competition, if you're really passionate about it, it's almost like a drug. It's hard to quit. And it's really easy for us. It's if you look at kind of the history of sports, the athlete is 99.9% of the time the last person to realize it's over. It's just really hard to check out when you still have a little bit left in the tank. What keeps him going? I think he's one of the fiercest competitors we've ever seen. The fact that he made the cut at Riviera, a tournament that he hasn't done well at, I think probably gave him hope. I think his past too. I mean, how many times has he done this? Tiger doesn't look good, man, the game looks south. Wait a minute, he comes back. It's this cycle And because he's done that so often, I think he just thinks that's going to be perpetual. But the problem is he's had so many surgeries now, and he's 47 years old. There's just not he's just out of time, and I think the body at this point just it will no longer cooperate. I thought it was interesting going back and looking at some of the articles that came out after the 2021 accident. A lot of medical folks focused on the leg, and yet if you really dug into a lot of those articles, it seemed the foot seemed to be the bigger long-term issue with a lot of the specialists. And certainly this seems to be a problem. And listen, he'll be able to walk, he'll be able to still play, but if you read what this injury entails, there's very little movement and mobility left in that foot. And I mean, we're talking about a fundamental aspect, at least what Tiger believes is a fundamental aspect, is walking. And at least for the regular tour, obviously the Champions Tour allows for a cart, but if he can't do that, it's just hard to see him rising again to a peak performance that we've known Tiger to be able to do.
Yeah, and it's such a different picture than the one that we all have in our minds, right? The fist pumps and the red sweaters, and in those moments of dominance that were as recent as just a few years ago. And I'm not one of those guys who feels the need to work Tiger into every golf conversation I have. In fact, I'm sure like you, it becomes annoying after a while. But a couple months ago, I was on a radio show and they were asking me for my thoughts on how many times we should expect to see him this year. And this, I think, was back in January. And I said, probably at the most 2. I know we'd see him at Augusta. Let's throw in one more. I hadn't really counted on Riviera at that time. I was thinking probably the Open Championship in Augusta. Well, in the end, I might have gotten the number right, but the date's wrong because the body just literally isn't going to hold up. And everybody keeps saying, hey, he can still hit the shots. He can hit every shot. But the question is, can he walk? Well, that's a fairly sizable question. And in the aftermath of the surgery that just happened, it sounds like the surgeon, it sounded like his prognosis said 6 months to a year before he actually has full functionality of that limb again. That's not talking about putting the golf swing load on that right foot, right? So am I missing something here, Joel? Are we sort of holding on to hope more than hope would indicate is appropriate?
I think so. I mean, again, we're definitely a prisoner of Tiger's past of how many times have we heard medical experts count him out or say, the most recent back surgery was a quality of life surgery and not necessarily a surgery that was conducive to a golf swing. Obviously, the Masters following that surgery. The problem is that it just sets this expectation that instead of maybe cherishing that comeback for what it was, we just continually think it's going to happen. But I'm with you. I just think the expectation for a reason, and it's just odd to me too that we've had Tiger in our lives for almost 30 years now, and it just, at what point will that be enough? And I think just some people feel a certain way about him that they've just never been able to come to grips with an end or a finality. And the fact that golf does allow for guys to keep coming back and playing into their mid and early 50s, at least be competitive. I think what Phil did at Kiowa a couple of years ago actually now raised the bar a little bit of what you can expect from a golfer as they age. But instead of seeing those as aberrations, I think fans look at that now as just a possible expectation. And that's the disconnect I think that exists with golf fans right now to what's actually going on.
Yeah, and I cannot imagine ascribing some definition of weakness or a tarnishing of a legacy for the guy continuing to try. I mean, that's silly. His resume is what it is. And at the same time, we live in this culture of, are you not entertained, right? We cannot ever just say, well done, thank you, and you don't owe us anything else. It happens in all the sports. It's in some degrees, it's happening in the Tom Brady world, where people are wondering, well, how soon before he comes back? Folks, it's okay sometimes for the goats to head out to pasture, and it's awfully difficult for us for some reason. Maybe it's fan selfishness, I don't know, but it just seems awfully hard for us to say, you've given us literally everything we could ever ask for. Just go and live your life and be a dad and make yourself whole again.
Definitely agree with that. And I think what's most interesting to me is that and it's funny, it's changed a little bit. You can tell that the tenor of how Tiger talks has changed in this regard. But for the longest time, he seemed like a guy that had no appetite for ceremony. He did not have any interest of just showing up to wave to the fans, play his 2 rounds, and then miss the cut by 6 or 7 shots. He always sees himself as a competitor. I think he has too much respect for the competition in the game to be that type of player. Obviously, the Masters is somewhat different, but I don't see him showing up to other majors just to be there. And yet, as the few times we've heard Tiger talk over the past couple of years, there's a lot more reminiscing and a lot more nostalgia. I think he's more appreciative now of what he accomplished. He's starting to just lower his guard a little bit. It's actually made him a lot more endearing as a person to follow. And it's, for as much as Tiger was adored as a figure, he was never really beloved. It seemed like a lot of that just because that rapport with the fans wasn't there. So it's kind of nice that rapport is there now. It's just unfortunately it's at a point where he's just no longer a performer. And again, that's fine. He's 47 years old. It's just unfortunately at some point fans need to recognize that too, and kind of treat his appearances when they do come in the future, if they do come, with that kind of expectation that, hey, we're just kind of coming to see Tiger Woods. We're not seeing him to be the Tiger Woods be all new.
So with the guard lowered a little bit in your coverage of tour events, you're out there a lot of weeks in golf in general. Have you experienced personally any, I don't know, any moments with Tiger where you're like, hey man, 15 years ago, that was not happening. That was kind of fun.
I think the big one you hear is just Tiger, and I think a little bit of this comes with age as well as his injury history, but kind of taking other guys under his wing, helping them out. Obviously, Justin Thomas is a big one, but he does that with John Rahm. He's done it with Max Homa. Obviously, with Rory, as that relationship has grown over the past year. The fact that he's kind of going out of his way and being a statesman, that's just something that he never really showed any signs of wanting to be. And I think, yes, a little bit does come with maturing as a person, but I think a little bit of that also can be attributed to the fact that he doesn't see these guys as competitors anymore, or fellow competitors anymore. I think because he knows he's not necessarily of their rank in terms of what he can do week in, week out.
We're so far removed from the mess of 2008, 9, and all of that stuff that put him in a spotlight that was far from a positive spotlight. And I've said for years that I am so glad that all of us have the capacity to change and to improve and to make redirections in our lives where we need to. And for some reason, there were a lot of golf fans who just say he could never do that. That would, it doesn't matter what he does. Look at what he's done. And I keep saying to myself, have you ever heard of the word grace before? Have you ever heard of the concept of somebody saying, I really messed up and I need to put my life back in a more positive direction? Oh, aside from the physical frailty that he's experiencing, have you observed those changes? Not just, opening up your golf brain to guys who were your competitors and now are your colleagues, but I mean, just in general in life, does he seem like a different guy to you? You've been around him a whole lot more than I have.
He definitely seems more at peace with himself. And I think a lot of that has to do, people forget how big he actually was. I mean, still is, but when you're that big, a lot of your relationships around you tend to be transactional. And if you get burned a couple of times, you really put your guard up, and it's understandable that, maybe he wasn't the warmest guy to people around him just because he didn't know who to trust. I think, again, it's not like he's still the most personal person to total strangers, and yet I think he's lowered that guard just ever so slightly. He realizes that people don't necessarily want a piece of him. They just want to be around him. And I'm speaking generally of the fan atmosphere and, people around the game. But again, even players, like for years you would hear the Ryder Cup stories of just people that the fellow players didn't know how to treat him because he wasn't really one of them. He was among them, but wasn't one of them. In the past 7-8 years, be it in a player or assistant or just an advisory role, I think he's really become one of the guys, and I think he's really enjoyed that. I think he kind of saw maybe what he missed, and I think that's been one of the more fascinating parts of just to see him become this person. I think a lot of people didn't think he'd become.
Don't you think that the moment that he would declare himself done trying to be on the Ryder Cup team, that he would be named the captain of the next Ryder Cup team? It seems like an automatic.
You would think it's, I mean, put it this way, the PGA of America would love for him to be the captain. Where that could be is interesting. I think there's still obviously a bit of a live fallout. I think a lot of folks thought Phil would be the captain for 2025 at Bethpage. Now with Phil probably out of the picture on that front, I think that would be a great spot for him. Obviously, he won the 2002 U.S. Open at Bethpage. The New York crowds would certainly be behind him. And you just have to think with this surgery out and missing this entire year, you can't see him playing a full slate to garner. Even if he did really well in a couple of majors, it's hard to see him being able to play Bethpage as a player. So it would be interesting to see him as a captain in 2025. But yeah, after that it would be interesting because you would think the PGA of America would want him to be a captain at a United States spot, not overseas. So if it's not 2025, the fact that it'd be delayed to 2029 is kind of an interesting proposition. So I think watch this space for the next couple of months. And there's certainly some rumblings there, but nothing's official from what I've been told yet.
You brought up Phil's name, so let me just ask you a question about that, because I think at Augusta, the biggest storyline, the biggest surprise storyline wasn't that Rahm won. That was seemingly the consensus was that eventually that was going to happen, but it was what Phil did. It was ridiculous, coming out of nowhere after being maybe the worst player on Live Tour, but if not the worst, certainly down near the bottom. But he has cost himself so much in the legacy points leaderboard, whether it's Ryder Cup captaincy or just overall losing that Arnold Plummer-esque embracing of the fans. Have you ever gotten any hint from him if he regrets any of those decisions? I know the money was massive, and I think he owed some very bad guys a little bit of money. But do you think he wishes he could get a mulligan and roll the clock back about 3 years?
I think anyone that can tell you what Phil is thinking, it would be lying, because since that moment, he's just shut all doors to the outside world. The little conversation he has with the media tends to be orchestrated and tends to be set up. So it's hard to say, because you would think for a guy who was so publicly loved and loved being publicly loved, doing this decision that cost him everything, you would think would have a second decision on it. At the same time, though, you also hear reports he probably didn't have a choice, depending on what you believe of what spurred that choice. So it's interesting to see. I thought what was really interesting about his performance on Augusta was when he came back last year at Brookline, you would have a hard time explaining to someone who had been in a coma the past year that Phil was now a pariah, because he still had a lot of fans in the Boston area. Not so much at St. Andrews. I think that's a more learned golf fan that tends that. And when it came to Augusta, though, it was pretty reserved for a guy who's won there 3 times. And I think that does kind of show you the different dynamics of the crowd. The U.S. Open crowd tends to bring folks who maybe are just there for the sporting event, there for the spectacle, who aren't necessarily the golf zealots. The Open and the Masters are 2 different ball games on that front. You tend to have the more passionate golf fan at those events. And to see the reception Phil got from most of the weekend as he's making this really impressive charge for anyone, let alone someone his age, and to see it kind of mostly, I would call it indifferent for the most part, respectful but indifferent. I think that was just really jarring. I think you can kind of see it around some of the players too. Just, man, if he can't get love here, what's that say? So again, I have no idea what Phil's personally thinking, but it's just sad to see someone who, after 2021, that win should have got him a victory lap that lasted forever. He should have, no matter what he did the rest of his career, it didn't matter, because he pulled off something we didn't think could be done. And now, that seems like such a distant memory just 2 years out.
I'm so glad you brought up the barometer that is the Augusta patron, because they really, in America, I think that would be the golf crowd equivalent of the Open Championship crowd, right? It's people that are paying attention to tradition and lore and history, and at least on TV. And I wasn't there. I'm sure you were on the grounds, but it just as you said, it came across as tepid, polite applause when we all know what Augusta roars sound like, whether it's in person or over the broadcast. It's unmistakable. And untarnished Phil would have been receiving those roars at a almost Tiger-esque level. And for that not to be there, I don't know. I have to think that at some point when he got back on the private jet and flew back to wherever he was going, I got to think he was like, man, that just wasn't the same. I don't know. Like you said, if anybody can ever figure out what Phil is actually thinking, then they should write that book, because it would do pretty well. Shipnuck's trying, but I don't think anybody really knows all the way through. Back to Tiger real quick, Joel, before I wrap things up with you. And I'm curious. I know that every once in a while he will set his guard down entirely in an interview setting. It's not very often, but it's once in a while. If for some reason it was the Joel Beall moment when Tiger said, I'm going to give you 30 minutes, just me and you, roll your tape recorder and let her rip. What do you want to know from him still? We know a lot, but we don't know a lot as well.
I think first thing, what would you want to do going forward? It's been really over the past 7 or 8 months, especially, you've seen him take a more outspoken role against Live Golf and defending the tour. And it's interesting because he really doesn't have a dog in that fight. He's made his money. He's had his accomplishments. No one, whatever that comes to pass, I don't think that's going to diminish anything he's done. So what has kind of spurred him to take this interest in the fight? I think what he does on the design side is going to be really interesting. Just kind of know what constitutes happiness for him too going forward. How do you turn that switch off from being this fierce competitor and always prepping your body for the next fight to now knowing the fight's over? And how he kind of, obviously his children mean the world to him. And obviously Charlie's seems like a fledgling career ahead of him in the sport, but just what makes him happy and what he plans to do with the rest of his life, because he's, again, only 47, which in golf years is very old, still very young, just in terms of what he can do with the rest of his life. So I think that's kind of what I'd like to hear from Tiger Woods. I think it's also interesting going back through some of his past interviews. The one thing that really, I think, went unnoticed was when he talked about the 2019 Masters, when he kind of came back from the accident, was, at least I got that last one. So it seemed like he already somewhat accepted it, and yet I think his actions though say differently, because looking back, I mean, again, he made the cut this year, he made the cut the Masters last year, he made the cut at the PGA. I mean, the PGA really looked bad, but trying to traverse Southern Hills. Even St. Andrews, I know he missed the cut by a mile, but the fact that he kept walking over Swilcan Bridge, I mean, he knows, he's a historian of the game. He knows someone of his stature, when it's possibly the last time as a competitor at the Open, you stop and say goodbye. The fact that he kept walking, I think, shows even he is not 100% to give it in yet. But man, July feels like a long time since, or July seems a long time ago from what we saw at Augusta. So yeah, I think he's not going to play the rest of this year, and it'll be interesting to see if it's the Masters in 2024 or if it's another year after that. And if that's the case, is he really willing to put his body through all that stuff behind the scenes? We don't see all that pain and the emotional and cognitive and just physical toll that takes on you to kind of come back just to try to make a cut. So I think it'll be interesting in the next maybe 8 or 9 months to see what Tiger Woods does, because it's going to say a lot about his future.
I was just thinking about this. Golf is the one professional sport that lends itself to a cool down period. So you still have your juices flowing and you still want to be out there, and you still have the ability. Hey, you're getting up into your upper 40s. Now you're 50. Well, you have an option. You can go play on the Champions Tour. You may not. I mean, there's still a guy out there who's in his 60s who's winning quite frequently by the name of Longer, but you have an option. No other sport. I mean, you've retired from the NFL. You're not going to play anywhere else. Retired from baseball. You're not going to a slow pitch softball league, and on we go through. Maybe you could play the 3-on-3 league in basketball, but who really cares? So if for Tiger, that option is taken off the table, that is an awful lot of competitive juice that needs a home somewhere. Is he Is he ever going to be a commissioner? Does he want to be tied into the actual running of the game to the extent that he would put on a suit or sit behind a desk or sit in meetings, countless meetings all the time, to fulfill that competitive side of things? I would be curious to know if he has that side of it in him, just because I want to stay connected to the game, and even though I can't play it. You think it's Commissioner Woods at any time in the future?
I don't foresee that, just because I don't think he wants to deal with all the nonsense that kind of goes along with that role. I think he's honestly more powerful in the role he's in right now as kind of an advisory guy, that can kind of just jump in when he wants to. And that's a big role. That's a position that requires full attention. He has so many different endeavors going, both with his coursework, with his kids, his charity alone, it takes up a lot more time than I think people realize. So, I think him taking an interest in the infrastructure and the direction of the tour and just the sport's future, I don't see him taking such an official role with the tour, at least in that capacity.
Well, we know this. He is not a guy given to rash pronouncements. There's not unlikely to be a tweet later this afternoon that says, I have decided to, step away from the game forever. That's unlikely. Probably in our future, there will be a few more attempted starts and maybe even a couple more made cuts. I mean, who really knows? But we certainly are nearing the very end of it. And I think in the end, the answer to the question I started at the beginning, which what do we do with Tiger Woods? If I was giving my advice, it would be we appreciate what's happened and we don't put any pressure on him to deliver more of it, because it's probably not in the tank. What would your final answer be to that, Joel?
I think exactly that. Just there's not much in the tank. Just instead of looking at this in a negative connotation or a dark connotation, just be very appreciative that fans got to experience this for nearly 3 decades, and whatever happens kind of going forward is gravy, but also just really temper the expectation and forecast, or if he does come back, and if he doesn't, just be very appreciative that you got to experience it.
Yeah. Where are you off to next?
Believe the PGA Championship, so only a 4 or 5 hour drive from here, which would be nice. So no airplane this time, but at PGA, and then after that I think a couple of tour stops before LACC. So it should be a fun spring and summer.
They will make up for that time saved in the airports by putting you on the media shuttle for about 3.5 hours. So enjoy.
Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.